Welcome. Thank you all for coming. This is probably the most beautiful room I've ever had the pleasure to speak in, so thank you for coming. I'm excited for this. I'm excited to share this space with all of you. I hope you all found a little gift on each of your seats. If you didn't, you could reach under your butt and see if something is hiding there. Those are stones that I brought with me from Vermont, where I live in America right now. They're stones that are found all around Lake Champlain, which is the lake where my family's farm is situated at the north edge of Vermont on the Canadian border. And they're very interesting stones. I grew up as a child collecting them with my mom and my dad and my sister. And they always seemed very mysterious to me because they have these white lines running through them. And for a long time, I thought that those white lines were lines of quartz, a different kind of stone that had just formed at a different time in geologic history than the shale, which is the gray part. But about a year ago, I learned that actually those white lines are something else. The way these stones were formed is that about 500 million years ago, all of Vermont was located down near the equator, and it was covered in a tropical ocean. And in that tropical ocean lived all of these small sea creatures. And these creatures would suck the calcium out of the ocean water, and using that calcium, they would create structures. They would create shells and coral, and they would live in these structures. And then over time, the creatures would die, the calcium would dissolve into the water, and it would make its way down to the bottom of the ocean. And on the bottom of the ocean, clay was forming slowly by mud falling down, and then it would eventually vitrify and turn into clay. And every 5,000 or 10,000 years or so, there would be an earthquake or some kind of seismic activity, and it would cause all the clay to crack. And the water would flow down into those cracks, carrying the dissolved calcium carbonate with it. And then 100 million years later, when the oceans had all evaporated and that landmass had moved north up to where it is now, all that was left over as evidence from that time were these white trails that used to be the homes of these creatures. And then the stones all broke up into little fragments, little pieces, and we find them like that today, little circular stones that have been slowly massaged by the waters over the years. And they have all different patterns. And they seem to speak of this different time when the fragments were not yet fragments, but when they were part of some larger underlying wholeness. And I became really interested in this idea, the way that these stones once connected, and if it would be possible to connect them again. And thinking of that also as a metaphor for other kinds of fragmentation that might also want to find its way back to a kind of wholeness that used to exist. So I love these stones because they're like mysteries hiding in plain sight. I grew up with these as a child, but they seem to point at this deeper underlying mystery. And as I think about my work over the years, some of which is on display at the De Broca Grande right now, a retrospective with 10 of my projects. And if you see that show, you'll see there's lots of different types of work using lots of different types of mediums. And I was trying to think about what are the connections, like those lines of the stones, what are the connections that run through all of those projects in different ways. And the thing I come back to is this really simple, universal human curiosity about why we're here and how we're here and what this life is and how it works. And I think that over the years, using different mediums, I've tried to explore those questions using different tools. This feeling that if you travel far enough to the edge of the world, you can kind of peek behind the curtain and somehow understand how it works. Which is a very old notion. This is an old engraving that's quite famous that speaks for the same impulse. And yet, what I didn't know as a child when I started out this way is that the farthest you can ultimately travel is to come back to the place where you already are and to see that place with new eyes, as T.S. Eliot famously said. But I want to tell you about that journey, all of the different ways I've tried to kind of look at the mysteries of how we live. And that's what I'd like to do today in this time we have together. So first of all, I just want to spend a moment on this question of what technology is. You know, we're at a film festival. I'm here as part of Doc Lab, which is billed as the kind of evolving technology of cinema, virtual reality, digital art, and so on. So there's this question: what is technology? You know, are some things technology and other things aren't technology? And to me, I see it like this. I see technology as any set of tools that we use to shape our experience of life. And then, in turn, that life which we have shaped ends up shaping us in a kind of recursive loop. So technologies can be all sorts of different things, really any mechanism we have for shaping how our reality is, how our world is. And we do this in all sorts of different ways. In my case, I grew up in Vermont, where these stones came from. I spent really idyllic summers there, surrounded by nature. This is a picture of me and my mom when I was a little boy. And as a young child, I was a very introverted, shy kid. I had some early health problems. I had seizures where I would have these staring spells and be unreachable. My parents would shake me and I wouldn't respond for like a minute at a time. I stopped breathing when I was 6 months old and was resuscitated by a live-in nurse that we had living with us and taking care of me. And those problems continued for the first 5 or 6 years of my life. And I think that in some kind of deep way, life was a very scary place to me. Even the grasp on consciousness was very tenuous for me, and I would lose it from time to time. And so I sought refuge in art. Art felt like a safe world that I could create, where I could control things, and things felt okay there. And so I kind of started making art at a very young age. These are some portraits of my stuffed animals that I did when I was 6. And my mom was great about saving a lot of this stuff, so I have these incredible records now of all of this stuff I made over the years. This is the first painting I ever made at probably the most awkward time of my entire life, with the big frizzy hair, the braces, and then the cut-off pajama bottom pants. And it's kind of a jungle scene with different Amazonian animals. I was also really into video games as a young child. I was especially interested in kind of quest games, where the main characters had to go on these adventurous journeys to discover different kinds of secrets. I loved The Legend of Zelda, Shining Path, and Kyrandia, which are pictured here. They were some of my favorites. As I got a little older, in high school, I started doing landscape painting. I had a really wonderful teacher named Tim England, and he taught me how to paint, and I would have a little easel, and I would go stand out in the outdoors and paint these scenes in changing weather. In my late adolescence, I was visiting New York City and saw this show in Soho by a photographer from America called Peter Beard, who had spent a lot of time in Africa. And he kept these really wild sketchbooks filled with photographs and writing and drawings and his own blood and insects and ticket stubs and all of this kind of ephemera from his life. And he and I had actually had a similar background. We had attended some of the same schools growing up, even though he was kind of 2 generations ahead of me. But I felt a lot of kinship with his sketchbook work, and it inspired me to start keeping sketchbooks. So in the middle of college, I started keeping these handmade journals, and I would fill them, like Peter Beard, with these records of my life. And this became a kind of daily practice of processing experience through painting and writing and capturing pieces of plants and insects and ticket stubs, and very much in the style of Peter Beard. And I kept these books for about 4 or 5 years. I have a whole stack of them, and they were kind of a constant companion for me. And I stopped keeping them very abruptly in 2003. I was traveling in Central America at the time, and I was robbed at gunpoint by 5 guys who put a gun on my head and took a knife and cut the strap of one of the bags I was carrying. And among the things that they stole was a sketchbook with about 9 months of work in it. I also got beaten up pretty badly, and I had to go to the hospital. And I took this as kind of a sign from the universe to change paths. I had at that point been studying computer science at Princeton, where I went to college, but I hadn't yet found a way to use computer science as an art-making medium. They were really two totally separate parts of myself. There was this kind of romantic, tactile, sketchbook, traveling, adventure of life kind of persona that was kind of modeled after Peter Beard. And then there was this very kind of rational, logical, procedural computer science persona that I was kind of training myself to step into through the academic work I was doing in college. And they felt totally unintegrated and separate. And around that time, I decided to make this dramatic turn towards data, away from these tactile objects. And it coincided with a year-long fellowship I had at Fabrica in Italy, which provided a wonderful container for those explorations. And the first project I made was this one, which kind of couldn't be more different aesthetically from the work I've shown you so far. It was kind of cold and crisp and clean and very controlled. And this, to me, was the aesthetic of computer science at the time. And this was a project called Word Count that was a very early and very classic data visualization project that simply took a list of words that are most frequently used in the English language and displayed them side by side as a very long sentence based on how often they occur in the language and scaled based on that. And then I made this interactive interface to explore this data set, which I can show you here. So basically, you have this long sentence that trails off into minuscule words, and then a graph down here that you can use for navigating it. So you can move to any position in the sequence. There's about 86,000 words contained here, and you can see the sequence of words that occurs there. What was surprising about this project is that people loved this, first of all. In the early internet, it was kind of 2003, so people were sharing things just using email, but it spread around quite broadly. And people started emailing me sequences of words that they found in the data set that they thought had some kind of meaning. So, for instance, if I search for America, you can see America ensure oil opportunity. Or if I search for Microsoft, you can see Microsoft acquire salary tremendous. At the time, Microsoft was more successful than they are today. Hadn't been eclipsed by Apple yet. But it was really interesting to me that these are not conspiracies. These are just artifacts of a sufficiently large data set, but that people found meaning in this. And even in this cold, crisp, kind of inhuman aesthetic, people found a certain kind of weird humanity. And I've received hundreds of emails from people with all sorts of different sequences that they've found. One of my favorites is just a 2-word sequence, but you can go for construction, and you just see construction ahead. So this was kind of some weird early insight in terms of data visualization for me, that even this kind of rational framework could be a host for humanity. And that insight inspired me to kind of keep going. I think we won't update Keynote right now. And around this time, when I was at Fabrica, I had the chance to visit Ars Electronica in Linz, and I was totally blown away and inspired, and the course of my life was changed by seeing this project called Listening Post by Ben Rubin and Mark Hansen, 2 American artists, which is basically a grid of LCD screens that displays sentences taken from internet chat rooms. If you remember, internet chat rooms were once a thing in the early days of the web. And it kind of found these sentences and then displayed them on these screens while a computerized voice read them out with a simple kind of droning music playing in the background. And for me, this was I can't describe it in any other way than saying it was a religious experience. I remember lying on the ground for about 3 hours in front of this piece, just letting the sound and the voices wash over me. And I had this feeling that I was glimpsing the birth of a new kind of organism on Earth, which was our human species, that was coming into self-awareness through the internet. And I became obsessed with this idea that we were eclipsing the evolution of individual bodies and entering a new phase of evolution that was our whole species. And I became fascinated with all of these questions, like, Well, if that's true, what is that organism? What is this species organism? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it believe in? How is it changing? How is it growing? And it seemed to open up a whole new landscape for me of this new kind of portraiture that was suddenly possible of all of us together. The same way that cells in our body have their own reality, but they're also totally part of our body, which has its other reality at another scale. In the same way, each of us have our own realities as individuals, but we're also part of this other reality of the species and the planet. And I saw the internet as uniquely positioned to make portraits of that species through the data that we were all producing and putting online. And so for me, this opened up a chapter of life of like 5 to 10 years of exploring these kind of large-scale portraits. I was noticing, all of this human expression that used to happen in the offline world was moving online onto these new online platforms and things like MySpace. And it was very ugly and messy and chaotic, and it didn't feel kind of so-called human in the way that those early sketchbooks maybe did. And yet this was all put here by people. And so I had this feeling that there was great beauty hiding here to be revealed, if only it could be extracted and reframed in a different way. And so this led to a kind of a breakthrough project for me, which was called We Feel Fine, which basically was like a search engine for human emotions. It works by scanning all the new sentences that are posted on blogs every 2 or 3 minutes, looking for any sentence that contains the phrase "I feel" or "I am feeling." And then it also identifies demographic traits about the author of this phrase, like their age, their gender, their location, and the weather conditions when they posted it. All of that information is saved in a database. The database grows by about 20,000 feelings every day. It's been running for 12 years now. It's tens of millions of feelings now that have been collected. And for this data set, we created this website to display the data. I worked on this project with a really good friend of mine named Sepp Kamvar, another computer scientist. And we made this data visualization that visualizes these human emotions as little rainbow-colored dots flying around. And you can see that the dots are already showing human characteristics. Some of them are demonstrating curiosity and checking out the mouse cursor. And as I move that away, they lose interest and they go back to their explorations. If I click the background and move around, they show fear. They're running away from me now. And all of the dots correspond to the types of sentences inside. So the brighter ones are more happy sentences, the darker ones are more negative, sad sentences, and the bigger dots are longer sentences, the smaller dots are smaller ones. So I still feel his humanity despite some of the missing parts. I mean, they're just so beautiful. Some of these sentences come through, and you couldn't make this stuff up. It's people are just so talented with what they posted online, especially in the early days of blogging. So We Feel Fine allowed us to do all sorts of other things too, other than just show the sentences. So we have these different movements that use the data in different ways, almost like making it dance, like you're choreographing data. So here you see the sentences coming out one by one, kind of as a typewriter. Montage takes sentences that also have pictures. Then Mobs shows kind of demographic traits. This is showing the most common feelings overall right now. Gender breakdown, age breakdown, the weather conditions when they were posted, and their locations on a world map. Metrics is more like a stock market for feelings, so it's showing feelings that are occurring more than normal at the moment. So you can see the world is feeling lucky at 2.8 times the usual level, comfortable at 1.8 times the usual level, and so on. And then getting even more abstract, you get these mounds, which just show you the most common feelings in the history of the project is these jelly blobs that jiggle and dance when I hold the mouse down. And there's about 5,000 adjectives that are tracked by We Feel Fine, and they get progressively more and more obscure as you go down the list. So you can see the people feeling coherent or tangible, or suspicious or sheltered or shameful. And then there's also a search functionality. So if you're interested in zeroing in on a certain population, you can check out women feeling maternal or materialistic in their 30s in the rain in a certain country, going all the way back to 2005. And then it will fill the website with people that match your criteria. So you can kind of investigate all of these different emotional demographic groups. So We Feel Fine was a beautiful project at the time. I loved it. And another thing it did is that it created these photo compositions. These are automatically created when a blog post that contains a feeling also contains a photo, and they get overlaid on top of each other, and they make these little postcards that we call montages. So I'm going to show you a few of the ones that I especially love. I feel like I am diagonally parked in a parallel universe. I feel so much of my dad alive in me that there isn't even room for me. I feel like Andrew has abandoned me. I understand how it feels to be rejected. I just want to feel alive for the first time in my life. I feel so happy. Man, this had better last. I can feel my cancer grow. I cried in my pillow that night for hours, feeling angry, disappointed, and frustrated, knowing I would never get to see my father again. I feel loved. I feel free. I feel pretty. I need to be in some backwoods redneck town so that I can feel beautiful. I feel skinny, but I'm not. I wouldn't hide it if society didn't make me feel like I needed to. I'm 23 and a recovering meth and heroin addict and feel absolutely blessed to still be alive. I feel like I'm in the center of that light circle. I can't wait to see them racing for the first time at Daytona next month because I feel the need for speed. I feel sassy. I feel so naughty. I feel these weirdos are actually an asset to college life. I love how I feel today. So Sepp and I made this project, made this website, and we were interested in doing some deeper scientific research with our data set. Due to the constraints of a web browser, the website that I showed you can only display about 2,000 data points at a time, but we suddenly had a database with like millions of feelings, and so we wanted to be able to run computations across that whole database. So we decided to make a book, and the book allowed us to do deeper scientific queries into our data set. So I'm just going to show you a few of the infographics that are in that book. This one is showing the top 100 feelings over a 3-year period of time. So you can see a couple trends here. First, you can see the dominance of better. That's the orange line. Better is always the top feeling in every demographic group on blogs for some reason. The next two are bad and good, the next top two. The declining blue line is bad, and the faint rising yellow line next to it is good. And as you will see, the bad line gets lower and the good line gets higher over 3 years. And when we saw this, we said, oh, this is very interesting. People are feeling less bad and more good. They're getting happier. Wonderful. But we looked a little bit more closely, and we found out that actually what was going on is that the blogging population was getting older over those 3 years, and that one of the strongest overall emotional trends is that as people age out of adolescence and proceed into life, they tend to get happier. Up until the mid-50s or 60s, and then there's a plateauing that often occurs, according to this data. And we actually compared our findings with a lot of the seminal social science research papers that have been published in the last 30 years and found that there was a high level of correspondence between the two, which was interesting. This infographic is called Shades of Emotion. It shows sentences from the database ranging from the most positive ones in the bottom right in red, I like him, that's why I feel so thrilled, and then the most negative ones on the inside in black, I was feeling suicidal and started cutting. And this gives you a sense of the range of the emotional landscape that people express through their blogs. This one is showing moods. Moods are clusters of similar feelings. So the mood of joy, for instance, is a cluster of about 30 different adjectives that are all generally happy, positive things. And you can see each of these graphs goes from 10 years old to 60 years old. So in joy, you can see what I was talking about, the rise in happiness that continues from adolescence up until the mid-50s, and then there's a little plateauing. Some of these really strong emotions like anger and disgust and sadness, they're really strong when you're a teenager, and then they start to decline once you enter your 20s. Related to this one, we tried to summarize a typical human lifetime in one sentence based on the feelings that you're most likely to feel at different ages, based on the data. We called it a life sentence. So it's we start simple, but soon fill up with angst and feelings of confinement until we leave those behind to go conquer the world before gradually trading ambition for balance, developing an appreciation for our bodies and our children, and evolving a sense of connectedness for which we feel grateful, then happy, calm, and finally blessed. And on the right shows the underlying data behind each of those claims. This one shows how time influences emotions, time at different scales. The second row is holidays. So the second row on the left is Valentine's Day. You can see spikes in the feelings of loved and special, but the biggest spike in Valentine's Day is the feeling lonely, which starts to rise about a week before Valentine's Day and stays high for a few days afterwards. The next row down, the third row, is a typical week. So here you see loneliness on the right. This is lonely weekends. So loneliness starts very low on a Monday, and then around Wednesday, Thursday, midweek, it starts climbing, and then it peaks on a Sunday night, the loneliest time of all, before people return to work on a Monday morning. The bottom is a typical day, showing how on the left, joy behaves through a day, joy starting very high in the morning, rising through the morning, and then once you eat lunch, it starts its inevitable descent until around you go to bed, and that tends to be the least joyful time. And then you see sadness is basically the inverse of that, starting low in the morning and starting its climb once you eat lunch. So this is a dangerous moment right now. You've just maybe had lunch. This is showing how geography affects emotions, focused on the United States, which is where a lot of the data comes from because it's working in English language. On the left, you see where the feelings originate. It's basically a population map of the country. And on the right are state-by-state comparisons. A couple interesting things to notice. The purple one in the middle there is people who feel things about God. So you can see the Bible Belt in the Deep South. The green one is people who feel sick. You can see a lot of the cold northern states and also Nevada and Florida where a lot of old people retire. These are places that feel sick more than usual. And then the bottom row on the left is people who talk about feeling fat a lot. And then on the bottom right is an obesity map of the United States, people who are fat. And it's an inverse correlation. So the states that talk about feeling fat the most are like New York and California and New Jersey, some of the healthiest states. And then the Deep South, where there's more widespread obesity epidemics, hardly ever talk about actually feeling fat. So anyway, lots of fun little tidbits came out of this. But around this time, after doing a number of these kind of big global portrait projects that I've been describing, I started to gravitate towards other artists and other makers who were making very different kinds of work. This is a still from a Werner Herzog film that we're showing at the festival this year called Land of Silence and Darkness, made in the early 1970s about people who are deaf and blind. The first part of the film is about people who become deaf and blind through their lives. The second part of the film is about people who are born deaf and blind. And I watched this movie yesterday morning, and it brought tears to my eyes again. It's incredibly powerful. It's screening again, I think on Wednesday or Tuesday, if you have the chance to see it. And it just brings up really deep and difficult questions. And there's a kind of power and force and depth to this work and many others like it that I found these information visualization projects were not getting close to. So I started to feel the limitations of this data visualization approach to portraiture, and I started becoming less interested in these big global things and more interested in kind of strange and specific things, shifting away from the very big, the grandiose in general, into the strange and specific. And that marked another kind of turning point for me where I started making projects that were more about going out into the real world and having experiences myself and documenting those experiences. But this next phase of work was kind of like a foot in both worlds. I still approached these projects with the sensibility of a computer scientist. So with the whale hunt, for instance, a project I made in 2007, I went up to Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost town in the United States, to live with a family of Inupiat Eskimos during their annual spring whale hunt. And I decided to document this project using a very kind of computer science approach, which was I gave myself some rules to follow. The rules were every 5 minutes for 10 days, I would take a photograph. When I was awake, I would take it manually. When I was sleeping, I would set up a timer. But then, when my heartbeat got fast and I became excited because of what was happening, I would increase the frequency up to about 40 photographs in a 5-minute period. So using this rule set, I gathered data of this experience over the course of 10 days, resulting in over 3,000 pictures of different parts of the hunt. So we were out there on the ice. This is some eider ducks flying over the open ice. We're about 4 miles from shore here. The ice is about 5 feet thick. And basically, there's a canal of open water that's about a mile wide at this point, and the whales migrate north through this canal up to the Arctic Circle, where they spend the summer. And so the whaling camp, with their captain, Simeon, kind of sits out on the edge of this ice, waiting for a whale to appear, watching. It's incredibly cold, incredibly slow, incredibly boring, days passing without seeing a whale. And then finally, when one appears close enough, you have about 5 seconds to react, to jump into the boat and go after it and shoot it with a harpoon. They ended up getting 2 whales when I was there, which I saw, and then they have this amazing kind of community system for getting the whale out of the water. They drill 2 holes down into the ice in a V, and they loop a big strap down there, and then they put the whale's tail on this big winch system, and then they have a huge tug of war, basically, between the humans and the ocean, both of which want the whale. The humans want to eat it, the ocean wants it, so that all the little creatures can feast off of the rotting flesh. And ultimately, the humans tend to win. They get it up on the ice, and then they start the process of butchering it, cutting it up, all using blades, and they line up all the blubber, the muktuk, and then they distribute it in equal portions to different members of the community. And this will be dinner 3 or 4 nights a week for most families in this community. And at the end, all that's left over is this whale bone, which they leave there, and that does float down to the bottom of the ocean and becomes a new ecosystem down there for all sorts of microorganisms. So anyway, with the whale hunt, I came back and I built this interface for displaying all the photographs that I collected there. So you can see this kind of combination of 2 very different aesthetics, like the tactile reality of the experience itself, and then this kind of controlled framework for showing the material. So these are the photographs arranged by time here. So you can see some of the stories, like the meta stories that are told by color. This is the wallpaper in the basement bedroom where we stayed. This is things going white as we go out onto the ice, and the reintroduction of red down here when whales were being killed. Timeline shows you the exciting moments. Each column is a 20-minute period. The height of the column is the number of photographs taken in those 20 minutes. So you can see getting dressed to go out onto the ocean for the first time was very exciting, and then all the whale butchering down here. And then a pinwheel is just a playful version of the timeline. But you can enter this at any position, and you can start to follow the story with a heartbeat. So you have this navigational graph down here, which is my heartbeat level throughout the 10 days. And then the photos progress with this kind of reliable sequence. And you can navigate to any position in the experience and see what was happening there. And you can also use this kind of DNA chooser to pull out certain sub-stories from within the larger narrative. So this is the cast, all the people involved, plus the 2 whales. So you can say, for instance, Roni, and these are all the concepts involved. So let's go blood and tools. And then locations, let's say the Arctic Ocean with a heartbeat level of fast. And you see the graph has just become a little blip at the end there. You can enter it. And now you'll see the story of Roni and blood and tools with a fast heartbeat level on the Arctic Ocean. So it was kind of a storytelling experiment to think about the DNA that makes up a story and different ways of rearranging that DNA to reveal different sub-stories within the larger narrative. So we feel fine, the whale hunt was one of many projects that happened in that phase, but the only one I'm going to talk about now. But this is kind of a lesson for me that came out of that work. These are projects that are incredibly controlled, like the discipline of the structure of how to record the pictures, the discipline of that, like every 5 minutes. And that structure becomes so physically uncomfortable, especially in the case of the whale hunt when it's negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit and you haven't slept in 4 days properly and you're hungry and you're cold and your camera batteries are breaking because of the cold, but you still keep going. So there's a kind of surrendering that happens to this control. And yet through that process, this kind of magical alchemical process of control and surrender, I have found again and again, and increasingly as I get older, that you end up opening yourself to a new thing, which is for grace to start happening through you. And what I mean by grace is things that you hadn't planned ahead of time, things you couldn't possibly know would arrive into your life, but that by surrendering to what's actually happening and to some kind of repetitive ritualistic behavior, magical things start to happen through you. You start to become a kind of a channel or a medium. In the case of the whale hunt, We didn't know if we would see any whales. We didn't know if we would even make it out onto the ice because the wind conditions were so unfavorable. So there was a tremendous amount of anxiety and not knowing and fear that the project was going to be boring. But it ended up working like weirdly perfectly. I mean, if you had scripted the narrative of how it unfolded, you couldn't have scripted a more beautiful narrative. And yet that happened not by design, but by grace, by life. And so that was like the birth of an insight for me working with the whale hunt, that something magic happens when you surrender to a process and you allow life to happen through you. And that's something that I've cultivated a lot more over recent years, and I'll talk about in a moment more directly. But I kind of think of the birth of that insight as happening with the whale hunt. But after the whale hunt, in that phase, I did a few other projects that involved kind of documentaries of different human communities, one with lesbian porn actresses in New York City, another with people living in Bhutan, a lot of monks and nuns exploring happiness, gross national happiness. And ultimately, I started also finding the limitations of that approach. I felt like I was always a spectator in somebody else's life, almost like stealing moments from them, using them as material. There was a part of me that felt uncomfortable with that approach, and so I thought it would be a wise next step to use my own life as the material and to turn the camera onto myself. And so when I turned 30, I left New York City and I started a daily practice of taking a photo and writing a story every day and posting them on the internet before going to sleep every night. Like the whale hunt, this was a very uncomfortable process for a few different reasons. Some nights I would be out at a party until 3 in the morning, and I would come home and I would have to post this thing before sleeping. And so I would be, drunk and tired and still trying to get this thing posted. Other days, not much would happen, and I would feel boring, but I would find something anyway. But again and again, and the more that I committed to this process, the more magic started to happen. And so I want to show you a few moments, a few days from this that were just full of magic in different ways. These are the 440 photos that came out of this project. I did it for 440 days, about a year and a half. This is one of the first ones. After I left New York, I moved back to my mom's house in Vermont, and I was cleaning out my childhood bedroom, threw out like 18 garbage bags of stuff. And one of the last things to attend to was a framed photo that I had on the wall that had been there for 11 years. And it was a photo I had taken of my first true love, my college girlfriend, Quinn, who I had never really gotten over, and she was always like a yardstick I would measure everybody else against, and that classic first love thing. And so I had her photo still on my wall, even though we hadn't been dating for 11 years. And I realized, it's probably time to take this down. So I took it down off the wall, and I opened the back of the frame, and I took the photo off, and I realized that the sunlight, which had been hitting the frame for 11 years, had created a ghosted replica of the image on the paper on which it was hung. And I kind of saw this and dropped it on the bed and gasped, and it just had this feeling that some memories are much more difficult to erase than others. About a week after that, I was driving out to Oregon, where I was going to live in a little cabin, the one I showed you a moment ago. And I was in the Badlands of South Dakota, kind of wild national park. And I saw a wooden sign for a road called Quinn Road. That was her name. And so I took this road. It was a dirt road with grass growing up through it. And all these grasshoppers started coming up out of the grass and hitting the windshield of my car. And these 2 grasshoppers just froze on the glass of the windshield. And I took a picture of them, and it seemed like they were like messengers from some alien species that was coming to deliver some strange, undecipherable prophecy. About a week after that, I was out in Oregon, and I was living in this cabin, and all these birds would hit the glass of the windows, not knowing it was there, and they would get killed by hitting the glass. And so this was one of the birds, and I gave it a little water burial with a little wooden raft and some plants and rocks, and sent it out onto the lake there. This was a picture I took when I was back in Vermont of a kitchen cupboard. My mom divorced my dad in the mid-1990s, and she had been living an increasingly hermetic, isolated existence for the next 20 years. And she also didn't eat vegetables. She only ate meat and drank V8 juice every day as her vegetable intake. And she was really like a solitary person who struggled with a lot of different kinds of mental and physical illnesses. And I was in the kitchen one day getting a plate to make my lunch, and I noticed there were these strange red marks on the kitchen cupboard door. And I was looking at them and trying to figure out what they were, and I realized that they were marks made by her nail polish from all of these years of reaching for a plate to fill it up with meat and eat it alone. And she would never let me take her picture because she was self-conscious about how she looked on camera, but to me, this was a portrait of my mother. This one, the text for this one said, split up but still close together. After hibernation, something to hold. This I took when I was living in Iceland, and I went to this hot spring with a friend who was living in the town, this German girl who was living there, and as we were sitting there, I noticed that the water was doing this thing to her body, that it was making it look like her legs were coming out of her head. And it was just one of these moments in life where you just say, wow, life is so much stranger than anything you could imagine. I mean, imagine trying to think up this. It's just so weird, and yet that's how it was. That was just how the optics worked at that moment. And, it was another one of these wake-up moments for me where I realized, life is so beautiful and poetic and strange and bizarre and mysterious, and it's happening all around us all the time, and we just have to open our eyes and see it. And so this image for me, it kind of embodies that whole chapter of the daily pictures. But I want to focus in on 3 consecutive days of that project that took place in Oregon, which is the state in the northwest corner of America, a very remote place. I was living there for about 4 months in this little cabin. This is the loft where my bed was. And when I got there, the first night, I had just driven across the country. And I was very tired, and I was so happy to be there. And I got up into the loft, and I crawled into bed, and it was really warm under the comforter. And it was totally silent because there were no insects, because we were up at a high altitude of about 4,000 feet. And I was lying there in the silence and the warmth and just loving the feeling of safety and having found this place after this long 10-day journey. And then suddenly, in the darkness, out of the silence, comes this screeching, horrible sound, like a screaming, like a person being hit with an axe. And I was like, what the hell? What is this? And I stood up in bed and turned on the light, and it was totally silent again. And then about 15 seconds later, the sound came again. And I said, well, I'm not just going to sit here in bed and wait to find out what this is. So I went down and I got a knife out of the kitchen drawer and a flashlight, and I went outside into the forest. And I was looking around. It was totally silent again. And then I heard the sound a third time, and it was coming from overhead. And I thought, well, that's strange. And I shone the light up overhead, and it was these tall, tall pine trees, and the light kind of disappeared into the height of the pine trees. But then down through the corridor of light starts these 2 white wings swooping down at me. And they came and grazed my hair, an inch above my head. And I wheeled around and shone the light to where it had flown off to, and it swooped down at me another time, coming this time about a foot above my head. And it was a great horned owl. And this experience ended up becoming an almost nightly ritual for the next 4 months. I would be in my cabin, I would hear the sound, I would go outside, I would shine the light, I would get swooped by the owl, and then I would go back in and I would go to bed. And it became a kind of weird, comforting companionship between me and this weird, curious owl. I lived there for 4 months, and it happened maybe a third of the nights, I would say, over the 4 months. And when it was finally time to leave, I was going to be moving down to New Mexico, so I had another 5-day trip to get down there. The neighbor came over, and he told me he had found a dead owl lying on his ground the night before I was going to leave. And he knew about these owl encounters I had told him, and so he wanted to come tell me this. And I went over to his house, and I got to hold this owl and feel its beak and its talons and spread its wings. We're not sure if it was the same owl that was swooping me or not, because the neighbor lived a few miles away, but the symbolism of it was very pregnant. And then I continued on. I left that day, and I started seeing owls a lot. They started becoming like a signal to me that, you're on the right path. Keep walking this way, or kind of like an omen almost. And so what I want to do now is I want to read you the stories that I wrote from 2 consecutive days, the day after I left the dead owl and then the day after that. And both of these stories took place in the same small town called Fields, that's right, Fields, Oregon. It's a gas station, a motel with 4 bedrooms, and a couple of little houses, and that's it. It's a tiny little town, and basically people go there to hunt birds called chukars. So there are these men that go on hunting trips to this town, and they go in the surrounding wilderness. So you'll hear that word, chukar, in the text, and it refers to a bird that they hunt. Okay, so this is the first day. Everything up above is twisting, winding up tight and preparing to explode. The beef cows know you eat hamburgers, and only the fence prevents their revenge. The hills are brown and blank and scruffy and look like the back of the velveteen rabbit. The bushes cradle the swamp grass, and the swamp grass is lucky to have something to touch. The chukar hunters at dinner talk about their good or bad luck, which means how many chukars they were able to kill. When owls have good or bad luck, it means how many secrets they were able to see. The night is about to get dark, and the only light in town is too high to touch, but that kind of light won't help you see secrets. This is the next morning. "You gonna kill anything today?" says a voice from outside my motel room at dawn. "Just a part of myself," I should respond. But I don't know that yet, so I don't say anything. The voice belongs to one chukar hunter who is trash-talking another by asking facetious hunting questions like, is he going to kill anything today, when he knows very well they are both going to kill something, and probably many things today, because they're chukar hunters, and they're here to hunt and kill chukars. Sometimes life will give you signs, and it's good if you can see them because they can show you the way and prepare you for what is to come. The most important signs are usually not labeled, so they're like secret signs. They occur in the physical world, but they map your inner landscape, and they're made just for you. Since they are secrets, you can't read them directly. Instead, you have to use feeling and intuition to uncover their meaning. The man at the motel asks me where I am going, and I say south. He says that, first, I should go north to see the playa. And I say that maybe I will. He says that, really, I should see the playa before leaving. And he smirks at me like there's something waiting for me there. I ask if I can take his picture, but he says no. And then I remember you can't take pictures of prophets. So I drive 20 miles north on a dirt road to the playa, which is vast and desiccated and totally deserted, with flat, cracked earth stretching on for miles. I see a blank sign, and I take the road it marks, which leads to the shore of the dried-up lake. I walk out onto the playa and feel the earth. In my fingers, it crumbles like feta cheese. Under my feet, it is soft like a yoga mat. After a while, I come to a piece of wood that points to the other side and seems to say, "This is the way." Soon, I see a small white box sitting in the dirt. As I get closer, I see it as a toilet, which is a very strange thing to find in the middle of a playa. Stuffed into the toilet and staring up at me is a coyote carcass, grimacing and terrible. Nearby, a piece of wood is separated from its shadow, which seems to say that something is about to change. I go to my car and I drive onto the playa in a trance, speeding and swerving and covering my eyes just for the hell of it. I stop precisely at the center and get out. There's a huge and perfect circle drawn in the dirt. I walk into it, and my whole body starts to tingle, like some kind of invisible energy is rushing through me. I spin around a few times, and I try to understand what it is. I think how the coyote toilet was the death of something shitty in me, something I no longer needed that was brought into the open and conquered in solitude. I think how the playa is like my whole life, and that this circle is a halfway point. Into the circle run tire tracks in various formations. Behind me, the tracks run in perfect parallel pairs. Ahead of me, the tracks cross and change places, and I wonder what this means. There are no tracks inside the circle. Behind me are the mountains covered in snow and foreboding, and ahead of me is the low mesa lit pink by the sun. Behind me is the past, the mountains like my ancestors, and ahead of me is the rest of my life with death on the other side of the mesa. I think about driving to the mesa, but I don't do that, because before you can know your future, you first have to live it, and for now, it's enough to understand the landscape. So I sit in the dirt, and I think for a while, and I write a little bit. And when I get up, I give the playa some water to help with the dryness. On my way back, I see the red skull of something that died, and I think about other things that have died. I drive south, across the beautiful, desolate wasteland of southeastern Oregon, and hardly see another car. I drive dirt roads through canyons, up and down buttes, over mountains, and across wide open plains. I'm looking for Willow Creek hot springs, which the motel prophet said I should visit. I get lost many times because there are no signs, and I venture 10 miles through sagebrush up onto the wrong mountain, only to turn back once I reach the summit, which is cold and gorgeous, with raptors gliding past me. I find the hot springs at last, and I get out of my car. There's one other car, a 1975 Chevy truck with a canvas tent pitched next to it, a barbecue smoking on the ground, and hip-hop music blasting. I wave politely to the man, who is big and gruff and dirty. Slowly, he approaches me. He is scruffy, unshaven, holding a beer, wearing holographic skull sunglasses and a camouflage hat, and he has a pistol holster strapped to his chest with an extra clip on the side. We're alone in a vast valley with nothing around for many miles, and I'm feeling a little scared. Vermont, eh? He says, looking at my plates. Yep. Sorry about that. You shoot guns? Never shot a pistol, but I've shot a rifle a few times. You want to now? My heart's beating fast, and I'm very nervous. And I try to think what would be the best way to handle this. I say, sure. He chugs the rest of his beer, paces out 10 steps, puts the can on the ground, walks back, and hands me the gun. Just cock it and shoot. Is there a big kick? Not like a .357. So I aim at the can, and I pull the trigger, and the can goes skipping along the ground, and my ears are ringing very loud, and I just fired his pistol. Damn! You sure you never shot a pistol before? No, I haven't. I guess I'm just lucky. I think he's impressed, and he lets me take his picture, so I feel a bit safer taking off my clothes and bathing in the hot spring, which now feels especially baptismal. Spindly green algae dance through the water and onto my skin, and the bullet casing sits next to me on a rock lit bright by the sun. The man drives off for more gas, leaving me all alone. I keep on south into Nevada, passing cows, casinos, and a Christmas light cross, which collectively satisfy just about any vice. It's late, and I haven't eaten since breakfast, and I'm tired and hungry, and I pull into the town of Battle Mountain, Nevada. As I drive slowly down the main drag and look at the only hotel and restaurant in town, I rub my eyes a few times in disbelief, but each time I see the same thing. So then I know where it is I will be eating dinner, and where it is I will be sleeping tonight. So that day felt like another turning point for me. It was a day that I didn't plan, that happened, you might say, by grace. I can tell you I was in a certain state of mind that day that was very open and receptive, and it was a kind of a trance almost, and I had this intuition that I don't normally have that helped me make choices. And so I made choices that day that I think I wouldn't normally make, and those led me into situations that I wouldn't normally find myself in. But something awakened in me that day, this sense that there's a kind of aliveness to life that is talking to you all the time, or at least that possibility is there all the time. And I didn't know how to wake it up again, I didn't know how to access it again, but I had felt it that day, and I felt it very strong that day, and I felt that something magic was happening. But it would be, again, a few years later before I started to revisit that feeling in any kind of way. But that day in Oregon always stood out to me as a special day for those reasons. So at that point, kind of entered a very difficult phase, kind of a stuck phase that ended up lasting for about 4 or 5 years, where I wasn't really making any new work. I wasn't feeling inspired by the internet anymore. I wasn't inspired by documentary anymore. I had stopped my daily photo project, and I really wasn't sure what next. And it was a time of a lot of searching and learning and reading for me. I started going to the Burning Man festival every year in Nevada. That's a picture of the grid of Burning Man, which I noticed it looks a lot like Amsterdam, actually, the canals. But I found a kind of energy and possibility space there that I wasn't finding anywhere else in my life. I started exploring psychedelics for the first time quite late in life. I was 27 when I tried that for the first time, and I want to share an experience that happened at Burning Man using psychedelics that was another one of these kind of turning points for me. It was my second year at Burning Man, and this was what the temple looked like that year. The temple is the structure that's burned ceremoniously on the final Sunday night of Burning Man. And it's a very kind of sacred space. People fill it with their memorials for people that died that year, or notes for ex-partners that are no longer in their lives. It's kind of people are crying all week long in there. It's a very intense, emotional place. And then it's burned on the Sunday night, and 70,000 people sit around it watching the burn in silence. Nobody talks, and there's no music. It's just the sound of fire. And it's a very powerful ritual that happens every year. And on this Sunday night of Burning Man, my second year, I took a pretty large dose of psilocybin mushrooms that a friend gave me. And I was sitting watching this burn, and I was on the ground, kind of in the front row. And then as the night bore on and the structure had collapsed, and what happens at Burning Man is once the structure's collapsed, they open up the fire perimeter, and then anyone is free to walk right into the fire. And people are walking on the hot coals and taking off their clothing and dancing in the embers, and it's very kind of primal environment. And as this was happening, this dose that I took, which was a pretty strong dose, started coming on in a really overwhelming way. And before long, I started kind of panicking and had become convinced that I had either died or something had happened to me, and I was never going to go back to the state of consciousness that I was in before. And this deep fear of that possibility set in, and things started kind of spinning out of control from there. Then I had the feeling of being at first, I had the feeling of being kind of one with everything, in the sense that other people didn't seem real, and nothing else seemed real at all. Just felt like a projection of the thing I was identified with at that moment. And at first, that feeling was very exciting. It was the feeling that I could manifest anything. I could become anyone. I could be Beethoven or Jesus or Buddha or Hitler. But it was just like this crazy feeling of possibility. And then very quickly, that feeling of possibility shifted into a feeling of total, utter loneliness. It was the feeling of being unable to connect with another being because there was no other being to connect with. And once that insight settled in for me, I really kind of lost it. And I didn't know what to do with what I was feeling. It was such a deep level of fear and instability that I just wanted to end it in any way that I could. And so I got the idea that I was going to stand up and I was going to walk into the fire. And I was seated on the ground, and I started a few times to get up, and then each time I would sit down again. And I remember I had this glowing L wire on my backpack to illuminate me at night, and it was like a lifeline back to reality. And I would feel this wire, and then I would remember, oh, I'm still here, I'm still in this body, I'm on the ground, and then I would lose it again, and I'd be in the state of deciding to get up and walk into the fire. And finally, I summoned the courage to do it. And so I got up to my feet, and I started to move towards the fire, and then suddenly, out of the blue, out of the darkness, a woman came up behind me, and she pushed me onto the ground, and she put her arms around me, and she started singing in my ear, and she said, in a sing-song voice, she said, "You are loved. You are so, so loved." And I looked at her, and I had no idea who she was. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and she said, "Is that enough?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Okay." And she let go, and she disappeared into the night. And I had the feeling that she was the combination of every woman that I've ever known, my mother, my sister, my childhood nurse that cared for me when I was sick, every partner I'd ever had. It was this total kind of loving presence, and it made me somehow believe that that insight I had had about the total loneliness was not right, and that there was something else because she was there. And from that point, the experience changed for me, and it became very strange and magical. And I started noticing people would pass me, and I would hear a fragment of their conversation, and it would be directly addressing the question that was in my mind at that moment. Or an art car would pass playing a song, and the lyric of the song would directly relate to what was in my mind at that moment. And I looked around, and I just had this feeling that, oh my God, this is all talking to us all the time, talking to me. There's some weird interplay happening between the so-called inner and the so-called outer worlds, where it's like a hall of mirrors. And it turned into this wondrous experience, and I wandered through the desert the rest of that night, and it was just, everything was full of meaning, everything was talking. And I had this feeling of life being this great treasure hunt to find ourselves, our way back to that insight, following the signs, following the omens, listening for the messages. And it gave me this powerful new hope and gratitude for being alive and for being able to travel on that journey. And so this is kind of this insight that came out of this experience for me, that somehow in some weird, strange way, perception itself is alive, and there's a kind of interplay that happens between what we think and how we think, and what we perceive and how we perceive. And I didn't really know any more than that then. It was just that kind of insight. But after that experience, I was really feeling stuck. Like I came back out of that, and the thought of making another website just felt like absurd. And so I spent the next few years kind of exploring what you might call the inner world, doing things like meditation retreats and lots of reading and different explorations, and continuing to work with psychedelics in different ways. And really just trying to find out, what next. I was living in New York for a lot of that time, but feeling really stifled by the city and overwhelmed by the city, and craving a simpler life closer to nature. And I decided finally to go home, to go back to Vermont. And so I moved back to Vermont in early 2016. I decided to do that in late 2015, and I had about a 3-month window of time before the moving date. And through those 3 months, my mom, who I showed you a picture of earlier, got more and more sick. She was in the hospital much of those 3 months. And the day that I finally moved home, which was March 5th, she died that day. She died in the afternoon, about 5 p.m., about an hour after I finished unloading my moving truck. And I was with her as she died. It was the first time I've ever been with a dead body or seen a death happen. The timing of it all just felt so strange and surreal, and very much like fate unfolding. And I had this moment with her. She died in her bed at home. My sister and I were with her, and she was listening to the final act of Parsifal, Wagner's opera about the knights who guard the Holy Grail. It was the only thing she wanted to listen to in the last 3 months of her life. And the sun was setting over the mountains as she died, and a few minutes after, Amanda, my sister, left to go get her 2-year-old daughter, Nora, to bring her in. And so I had a few minutes alone with my mom's body. And I felt this strong, strange desire to open her eye and look in her eye. So I crawled around the bed and kneeled on the floor next to her, and I opened her eye and looked in it, and was struck by a few things. The beauty of a human eye, the fact that I could see myself in the eye, and the fact that something in the eye was not the same anymore. It was missing something that it had had before. And in that moment, I had this really clear, strong insight that that our bodies are, they're like our spacesuits that allow us to stay here and breathe the air, eat food, talk, have experiences, experience time, experience memories, have the sense of being a separate self. That they're like these spacesuits that we have, but in some way they're not us exactly. And in that sense, I had the feeling that these are the ultimate virtual reality machines already. In my world, in the tech world, I had been exploring VR and going to conferences where a lot of people were talking about VR, and then with this moment with my mom, I just had this super strong belief that we're already in it. This is, we have these bodies, they provide us a completely convincing experience of a self-consistent world. We're free to walk around within it, and it just felt like to overlook that great gift felt funny to me. So this belief came out of that experience with my mom. And what also came out of this experience is that life is really the medium. After many years of working within rectangles of one kind or another, photographs, films, websites, cell phones, sketchbooks, paintings, there was this moment of breaking open the frame and realizing that this is what we're creating. Our experience of life is what we're creating, and we can do things to change it, and then we get to live within it after that and live within it with other people. And this opened up a powerful new direction for me that I'm just still exploring now, but it caused me to think a lot about the whole entirety of, in my case, my life, my family history, the land, my mother, myself, all of it fits together like a strange puzzle. And I started thinking about those stones again, the ones that are on all of your seats, and the way they are also like puzzle pieces that could be fit together. So I started thinking about, well, if life is the medium, what's a technology that can work with that medium? Is computer code the medium to work with life? Is painting the medium to work with life? They could be, but I was kind of looking for something else, and ended up finding my way to ritual, which is a technology that I've been exploring over the last 2.5 years or so, mainly on our land in Vermont. And I'm working on a project that's not finished yet, which will be called In Fragments. And I just want to give you a glimpse of 150 images from it. I've been working basically on a series of rituals that have had a lot to do with transforming materials from one state into another state, especially a glassmaking process that I worked on with a local glassblower. And what I'm going to show you now is 150 pictures taken from films of those rituals. I've been documenting them as I do them. And I still have about probably a year more of work to do on it, I think. But this is kind of a work in progress. So this is about 3 minutes long. So I'm not going to say much more about that now. Just in closing, a close friend of mine likes to say that in life there are only blessings and blessings in disguise. And as much as I can, I like to try to live with that belief. I think there's a power in trusting what happens as having a wisdom to it, even if that wisdom isn't always clear, especially in this time in the world, the time of many crises, looking around at our planet, at our species, lots of crises happening all over the place, lots of poison everywhere. I like to think that poison can become medicine eventually if the scale of time is big enough. So I kind of remain hopeful, even in a time of great poison. And I also want to say that even though this talk presented all these different ways of working, I don't want to suggest that any way of working is superior to any other way of working. It's not to say that documentary is better than data visualization or ritual is better than film, or no, it's so personal. We're each so different, and we have totally different contexts and conditioning, and we need to do what feels most alive for us, and that's going to be different for each of us. So even though the journey I just showed you was my path, there's nothing in that says it has to be your path at all, or that it should be anyone else's. So none of this is intended as an argument. It's just showing what it's been like for me. So I would just like to urge you to trust your own fate, whatever you find that is. And those little stones that I gave you, which are pictured here, I gathered 750 stones the day before I came to Amsterdam for the 750 seats in this room, and counted them out, each one, 651, 717, so on. And they're each different. Each of those stones is different, as we are all different. And yet those stones also once were connected to a different kind of deeper wholeness. So to remember that both of those things are true. Each stone is its own thing with its own lines of fate, and yet each stone, in some deeper way, is also connected to all the others. So I'll just, I think, leave you with that thought. And besides that, I'm so grateful for your attention, for this beautiful room, for being given this opportunity by Casper and Raul and the rest of the wonderful team at IDFA. And there's lots to see over at the De Boca Grande, however you pronounce that. I think that's wrong. Including a little secret space that you can find yourself in, made out of wood, which holds some of these images from the rituals that I showed you, and along with some other surprises. So I would urge you to go seek out that secret space. It's a very special place. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I want to ask on stage Jason Brush, who is EVP of Experience and Innovation at Possible. He teaches film and interactive storytelling at UCLA. I think he worked on the interface of the PlayStation, the BMW dashboard, Google Arts project, all kinds of various interfacing projects. But most of all, he's a good friend, and he's one of my favorite people to discuss the work of Jonathan. So please, Jason, come on stage. And thank you again.
Thanks, Casper.
I mean, one of the things that I'm curious about is so much of your work seems to be about being observant and kind of present, right? And I think a lot of us these days, a lot of the toxicity that describe is kind of stems from feeling distracted, feeling like we're not in control of, we're being, kind of our society, ourselves being kind of manipulated by technology in certain ways. And it seems like your work is all increasingly about having control and being present. And I'm wondering, what do you think we can do as individuals to try to, I don't know, be ourselves more present and observant?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that we're living in a time where human attention is the most precious natural resource. It's finite. We all have the same amount of it. It's being monopolized by companies, the same way that the great natural resources of the 1900s, oil and sugar and rubber and all that, were monopolized and great fortunes were made. That's now happening with attention. I think we all know that now. It's like pretty widespread. But the thing that's different about attention is that it's up to each of us how we choose to use it. Unlike oil, where once you own the land where the oil is, you monopolize that oil. But at any moment, we can choose to make different choices with our attention, because attention is really is synonymous with life, and what we pay attention to from moment to moment, that is life. And so by choosing to give your attention to something, you're choosing to give your life to something. You're choosing to make that life for that time. And when you realize that, it's a powerful insight, and you realize that you are a steward of that attention, and there are also practices you can do to become a better steward of it if you want. But it's really up to each of us how we choose to use it. Even though the products and devices are designed to be addictive, we don't have to give in to them if we choose not to. The other thing that I would say, which is a little bit more esoteric, is that to a certain extent, we make these distinctions between the online world, the offline world, giving our attention to a phone, giving our attention to a tree. This thing is nature, this thing is not nature. I mean, on a certain level, that is true, and those differences make sense. But on another level, there's a kind of equality that all phenomenal experiences share. Everything in the material world has something in common. It has a certain illusory quality to it. And sometimes I use the example of a screen, actually, like a cinema. I mean, you can go to a movie, like at this festival, and you can see this beautiful story. You can get so caught up in the lives of the characters in the story, and you take on their emotions and their drama. And it's true in a certain sense, but in another sense, that whole story is photons hitting a wall. And you can choose to shift your attention from the story to the photons hitting the wall. And those are very different states of perception, and they're both true at every moment. So even as we're here having this conversation, and we can say this way of spending attention is better than this way of spending attention, in another sense, they're all equal, and we just decide what we want our life trip to be.
Right, yeah. And the idea that we have this like finite capital of time, and also, I mean, attention isn't just time, it's also sort of emotional energy and sort of, and the amount of space that you have to sort of execute, to give that attention. And what's interesting is I think that in your work, a lot of it seems to be about your construction of things, right? Like it's yes, there are beautiful artifacts, but it's performative, right? Like and so you are, in your work, we see you make things, right? And you're able to, and the sort of observation happens in the act of making, right? In the act of constructing. And what's interesting is that so much of what you've done is kind of handmade, right? Like even the things which look kind of cold and analytical, right? You talk about word count, or even things which have highly digital aesthetics, right? We feel fine, are highly they're idiosyncratic, and they're really unique and are finely crafted. And then watching the work that you're currently doing, making glass from scratch, right? You're doing something in which there are big industrial processes. Like most of the technology that we use to make stuff is mediated by big industrial technologies. So you think about like photography or video, it's like, well, we're using Instagram or YouTube, right? We're not building our own content management system or our own interface. To what degree do you think that how can we be mindful of the things we make when we're having to do so inside of big systems that we don't construct ourselves?
Yeah, it's a very deep question. I mean, what comes to mind are a couple things. One is Marshall McLuhan's insight that the medium is the message. But what he means by that is that when you're watching a TV show, regardless of what happens in the TV show, the most important thing about the TV show is that it is a TV show.
Right.
Same thing with a movie. When you're watching a movie, regardless of the content, the most important thing is that it's a movie. And so the structure of the thing ends up having such a huge effect on what you receive from it, what the experience is, regardless of the so-called content that's happening within that structure. And so when you think of the ubiquitous platforms that we all use today, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, things like that, regardless of what you post on Facebook, the most important thing to remember is that you're posting it on Facebook.
Right.
And that fact, the structure that Facebook has defined, has such an enormous effect on the kinds of self-expression that can happen there and the kinds of psychologies that can unfold from those posts. And so in my case, I've always preferred to make my own things from scratch because you can design a process itself which is as important as the product at the end. And I think it's this focus on process that feels really essential right now. There's so much focus on outcomes, like even when you think about the global crises, like climate change or pick your favorite crisis, there's always this focus on outcomes, like we need to solve this problem, fix this problem. My suspicion is that the focus on outcomes is itself the problem, and that we need a new kind of process for relating to life from moment to moment.
Right.
And I think actually that's one of the things I'll talk about in the live event on Tuesday is what does that process look like? Yeah. But I think that's what is needed now.
Yeah, and that really underscores the final point you made about doing what feels most alive, right? And not thinking about what's most effective, right? But rather what feels, most...
I think we each have this inner compass that points us in a really good, wise direction, and it's hard for a lot of us to tune into it. I know it was hard for me to tune into it for many years because I was so in my head, so conceptual, thinking of all these ideas. But I've found that learning to listen for that inner voice leads you to the most interesting places, because grace comes in, what I was talking about earlier. That inner compass is different for each of us, and it's very powerful. Sometimes I have the feeling that life has a wish for each of us, and the more you stray from that wish, the stronger and stronger the signals get to get you back on track. And the closer you come to that wish, the more life unfolds with a feeling of ease and flow, and the signals become very subtle, and you can hear them and stay in a state of harmony and equilibrium for most of the time. But when you get really far off track, you get things like earthquakes and tsunamis and nuclear war, and so I think as a culture, we have gone very off track, away from harmony. But that as individuals, we can reclaim that for ourselves.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have. But
Okay.
I really, really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah.